We're talking about sharing our lives as well as our faith. And I'm picking up on the concept of what discipleship is that Simon's and the groups have already talked about. And if we're thinking about discipleship is more about the formation of our character into being Christ-like, that we become a better reflection of Jesus in all aspects of our lives, then clearly I think we're all agreed you can't confine it to a course or a program to participate in. And as we are transformed more into being Christ-like, then it's inevitable really that all aspects of our lives are going to be impacted. And that's going to include our lives outside the church, or at least it should do. And unfortunately, in traditional churches, the kind of evidence that we've looked for to indicate a growth in discipleship has always been tied to increasing involvement in the church. Becoming an active church member has been seen the hallmark of a true disciple. The problems with being so church-centric and program-orientated are manifold, but what I want us to focus on now just is this one simple fact. This isn't how Jesus made and grew disciples. It's not how he lived. And if we're modeling ourselves on Jesus, then we need to be following his pattern of living in the lives that we already have. And I want to talk about the concept, instead of being a gathered church, that we are a scattered church. In the early chapters of Acts, we read of the new church developing and its focus being on, sorry, I'm getting messages popping through. So in the early churches of Acts, we read of the new church developing and its focus being on a developing a gathering together in which disciples grew into being more mature disciples, and this shared community attracted attention from others who wanted to know about the Jesus they followed. Now, I've lost count, and I suspect probably so have you, of how many times people have said they just wanted to get back to the simplicity of this embryonic early church. You can raise a hand if that was you, because that's a constant theme. On the other hand, I've never heard anyone say that they aspire to be like the scattered church that we read about in Acts chapter 8, a church of disciples that is driven apart by circumstances outside their control. And yet it's that scattering that seeded the gospel message in other places in double quick time. Only the apostles, we're told, stayed in Jerusalem. Everyone else dispersed. And it is these dispersed disciples who went far and wide with the good news. It wasn't the A-team, it was the disciples they had made. And because of the scattering, these disciples learned how to be disciples in hostile environments without the backup of a well-resourced community of believers. And they definitely wouldn't have covered as much ground so quickly if they dispersed as larger groups. So actually being forced to separate in different directions with only the Holy Spirit as their companion guide became formative in their lives as disciples, and they learned to rely wholly on the Holy Spirit instead of everyone else. So their discipleship began in the gathered church, but it continued and it developed in the scattered church. And I wonder whether we need to stop thinking about the church as a gathered church and more as scattered disciples. And that's one of the shifts that Simon was talking about earlier. I think that is an important shift if we can start thinking of ourselves in a different way. Now, I wonder about those dispersed disciples. Did they hanker after the good old days of Jerusalem? Well, perhaps some of them did, and they've now identified with all the laments of many Christians that have sounded loud and clear over the lack of physical communal gatherings this year. But I suspect most of them would have probably told us to stop whinging and get on with discerning what God is doing now and wants to do with us and through us in this new season. And they'd urge us to embrace the opportunity to engage with a new way of living, particularly with the people that are most in our lives immediately, our families and our neighbours. And some people, I think, are really beginning to grasp this. But actually, generally, I'm a bit disappointed to see how few people are beginning to see our dispersal as individual disciples into our different communities as a unique opportunity to live more authentically with those in our homes and neighbourhoods, and to share our faith with them face to face as individuals. And that's a real shame. I think it's a missed opportunity. And there's been, and rightly so in many cases, a lot of attention being devoted to putting worship services online. It's not necessarily bad, but we seem to be spending so much energy on trying to maintain what we had that I think it's distracting us from what we could be doing instead. We are still trying to center around it being a gathered community. And I think it is distracting us from a move of the Holy Spirit to do a new thing, as well as damaging our own formation as disciples. Because if we're to be disciples who grow disciples who grow disciples, then we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we too are in the process of still being grown. We're not perfectly formed disciples either. And if we're presumed to be the teachers of others, we need to retain enough humility to remain learners ourselves and be prepared to be taught in turn by those we share our lives with. And these may not be the people we would have chosen to learn from. But a couple of years ago, I came across a quote that really helped me. Pay attention to the people God puts in your path if you want to discern what God is up to in your life. Pay attention to the people God puts in your path if you want to discern what God is up to in your life. And that's really resonated with me. The people in my life at the time were not people I'd chosen to be around. But instead, I found instead of trying to get away from them, I felt convicted to pay more attention to them on the basis that God had put them in my path. And therefore, he must have put them there for a reason. They continue to teach me, and I can see why I needed them in my life. And in the clear absence of an answer to what God is saying to us as disciples and as a church, I think the question, who are the people in your path, is one that's most likely to help you discern what God is doing in your current context. And that follows on to a question, who should therefore we be paying attention to? Might give us some clues to help us discern how clearly we are meant to be living. Because these are the people with whom we're sharing our lives. And if we're sharing our lives, surely we should also be sharing our faith with them. And if we're not, why not? And I want to just very briefly address a couple of reasons why we might be so reluctant. And I think the main reason is it actually feels very awkward. It feels really quite hard to suddenly say to people, you've got a good relationship, you bring the God thing in. I like what Terry was saying earlier about God talk. You know, how do we do this naturally without wrecking friendships and relationships that we have? But you know, Jesus called people who did not understand him and constantly questioned him to live alongside him as he brought the good news to them. He asked those who didn't understand his journey to the cross and beyond to share his life. That's how he grew disciples, who then grew disciples. He showed them what it was to live as a disciple, and he walked alongside them as they grew. Very easy just to stand up in a church community and talk about Jesus. It's also quite easy to commit to going to church every week. But if you try sharing that same message with your family and your neighbours, it's a very different story. And I think it's because they know what we're really like. They're not just going to question our theology, a lot of them won't even be interested in it, but they can focus on us personally. And sharing our faith with people who see us at our worst can be very problematic for us. They can see when we're skating on thin ice, and it worries us. But when we live with the detachment between faith and life, we're not living lives that are whole. They're certainly not lives that reflect the way Jesus lived. He was honest with his friends, even when they didn't understand or they were confused by him. So one of the questions I want to pose to you is, do you have people in your lives right now who don't go to church or follow Jesus, with whom you can be honest about how your faith journey is going? Because I think we should all have friends like that, not so that we can convert them, but just so they can share a little of what's in our hearts and have a greater understanding of what it is to be a disciple. And we also get to understand a little more what's in their hearts. I have a friend like that for the last 15 years. And you know what? She's better than any spiritual director I've ever had at really dissecting what's going on in my spiritual life. I want to talk about family now. For the past 7 months, my eldest daughter's family has been myself, my husband, and her siblings. As of tomorrow, it's going to actually be 2 people that she's sharing house share with in her university. So I'm using that term very loosely. It's up to you to decide what your family is. But I would really like to just make a plea about how important it is to live as a disciple and share your life properly with the people that you're in the closest relationships with. Jesus grew up in a family, in a village. He was known. It's where he learned to do everything. He learned to grow. He learned to speak. He learned by watching his father how to be a carpenter. Most of us live in a situation where we are brought up. Well, all of us live in a situation where we're brought up by someone, and we take on many of their attitudes and their values and the way they do things. So when we live as disciples amongst our families, this is what we're doing for them. If we do not prioritize them, then what are we saying to them about Jesus and how Jesus sees them? I think giving them the gift of our attention can speak volumes about how they see Jesus. And I think it's very easy to be forced to prioritize ministry commitments by other Christians more than anybody else. So I'd like to just really emphasize how important it is that we share our lives properly with our families so they can see the love of Jesus in us for them. It surely should be the most obvious place to demonstrate what being a disciple is like. Secondly, our neighbourhoods. Lockdown has given me a crash course in becoming rooted in my location in a way that I wanted to be, but wasn't sure how to begin. I know everyone in my street now by name. I know the guy up the road lost his father last week and he's grieving. I didn't even know his name in March. I think many of us have had these kind of experiences, and I don't want to lose that by suddenly having to put all my attention into traditional church things again. But when people in my village ask me what I do and I say I'm a Baptist minister, do you know what? I'm actually quite reluctant to say that, because I suddenly realise they're going to judge perhaps my faith and Jesus on how I respond to them and how I behave. And that really does quite worry me. You know, when someone shouts at me because I'm having a bonfire at the wrong time of the day, I can't say what I really want to say. These are very small things, but they matter in a neighbourhood. But this is how Jesus lived. He didn't just talk the message of good news, he lived it. He had sufficient people around him who could watch how he lived and who could bear witness that the man and the message matched up. And by sharing his life, his followers learned how to be disciples. Before we go into breakout groups, I just want to draw your attention to Matthew 5, verse 13, where Jesus tells his disciples they are the salt of the earth. Now, it's much easier for scattered disciples to be salt in their neighborhood and their families, because salt is sprinkled sparsely. It flavors what's already good. Too much salt makes a good meal entirely inedible, as well as unhealthy. And disciples en masse in a visible church often have a tendency to take over. A lone disciple has to join in and add value to what's already happening. And it must be over 13 years ago, I had a picture during a prayer meeting of salt being smashed and scattered all over the hillsides where I live. And it was a vision of salt flavouring the whole area instead of being clumped together in a solid mass at the bottom of a valley. It's a picture I'd actually forgotten about until this summer. and it came back to me again. And I firmly believe our call today, and it is the right time to be salt by really sharing our lives with our communities as individual disciples. And in doing so, we will naturally be sharing our faith because it's part of who we are. And by doing this, we will not only grow as disciples ourselves, but we will begin growing new disciples. So we're going to break into groups now, and I'd like you to consider these questions. How can you be a disciple who makes and grows disciples in your family and neighborhood? Do you find this hard to do, and why? And then finally, what would it look like to become a church of scattered disciples rather than a gathered community we call church?